So, Raj, when we first met, you were the Chief Strategy Officer at Lyft. I was at PC Magazine. You brought me on, I think, what was my first self-driving car ride.
Yeah, I remember that.
In Las Vegas.
Still 5 years away. Always 5 years away.
Always 5 years away. We got close. But so from that background, how did you find your way into the climate space?
Well, it actually came before Lyft. So back in 2007, I went to TED. And it's a great conference, and there was Al Gore and John Doerr. And from my perspective, I've always felt I want to have some cause that I'm focused on. In the old days, it was business or cause. Of course, now they're merging together. And I heard such a convincing argument, first on the data by Al Gore, and then the emotion from John Doerr, who's running one of the top VC firms, Kleiner Perkins. He brought his daughter on stage, who was in tears. He was in tears about the future, and I thought there is not a more difficult problem that faces every single person in humanity that I should be working on than this. And so I just totally got bought into it. At first, I thought it was an awareness problem. So I had this idea, which I actually told John Doerr. They asked for ideas in the audience. I said, I'm going to create a game on Facebook. Remember, there were Facebook games. Anyone ever remember Facebook and games? And it was called eMission. It was a Sim City for Habitat. And this was outside of my job as a venture capitalist. Somehow, the EPA gave me $500,000. And we launched the game. And it didn't really work.
So, the game didn't work, or it didn't accomplish
the game
what
worked,
you wanted?
But no one really took the offline actions to help these critters survive, which was kind of the game dynamic that was there. It was beautifully done by someone from Zynga, which was a top game company. So then I scratched my head and said, maybe I should invest rather than create games. And so we at Mayfield, which is a VC fund I used to be at, looked at opportunities that were more capital efficient that could go after in the clean tech, and we can talk about the differences there. And in short, I looked at transportation and said, wow, that's really inefficient. And I thought, why don't we use the marketplace concept that the internet had job boards? Maybe there's a ride board out there, and I found this little company called Zimride. And that company, then its business model didn't work after I invested, and we morphed into Lyft, which did work. So that was kind of my journey. And then after, I did some other things in healthcare, but came back to wanting to make a difference around climate. In 2020, so I was running electrification and self-driving of the Lyft fleet, which is the future for Lyft and Uber. And it was clear that we had to focus on our core, both Uber and Lyft. And at that time, I also saw clean tech become climate tech, which was much more broad-based. And I just had the urge to get back in, so myself and my partner started Climactic.
So we had Mike on earlier. What do you see as the role of a VC, the unique ability of a VC to sort of accelerate climate change tech?
Yeah, so when we take a super high-level view, we need to get the planet to net zero. It used to be 2050. I think in the last 6 months, scientists have said 2040, which is really around the corner. And if I then look at that, there's a BCG study that showed that there's an innovation gap that we have to get there. So about 35% of getting to net zero is not accounted for from existing technologies. So that's wind and solar, primarily renewables, electrification of mobility and other things. The challenge is not only that there's this gap, but all of those technologies have not moved fast enough. We have the Ukraine crisis. And renewables didn't save the day, unfortunately, because there was just not enough deployed. So venture capital's role to get to 2040 to 2050 is to basically accelerate those existing technologies and create new technologies for that gap. So there is a real role. Venture's not going to solve everything, but it's an important element within it to do it. And so from my perspective, what I see is that if you are investing in early stage companies and you want to have impact by 2040 or 2050, the next 5 years are critical for company formation, for funding companies, and for helping them. And the thing that Silicon Valley knows well is a word that one of our investors is Reid Hoffman. He has a book called Blitzscaling, and it's about how can you go from 0 to 1 billion really fast. We used to want to just do that for economic reasons. Now we have to do it because it's an imperative for the planet. Actually, for humans, the planet will be fine.
That's right. A couple of people have said that today.
Yeah.
So it sounds like just yesterday here at Climate Week, you've made some progress along that path.
Yeah, so we hosted yesterday a very oversubscribed event for Climate Tech Meets AI. We did a market map and found that just about 6 months ago, there are over 100 companies that have sprouted only in the intersection of climate and AI in doing it. And the things that AI can really make a difference, I know AI has been talked about a lot, it's around the data analysis, it's around prediction, which is really important. When you have a huge amount of variables, it's really hard, and the algorithm doesn't, a static algorithm doesn't work well. And then in addition to that, now with generative AI, it's around communication, which is so critical too. So yesterday we had a startup challenge. We had over, I think, 40 companies apply. We had 3 on stage, and we gave $100,000 to the winner that won it. And there were 3 companies that, and I think this is emblematic of what kind of innovation we're seeing. So one is a company that's using AI to figure out the nasty, hard problem of supply chains. So enterprises need to go to net zero. There's over 8,000 that have made a net zero pledge. We're now 90% of worldwide GDP is under pledge. Articles came out yesterday that hardly anyone is on track. And if you look at the actual emissions of those enterprises, you will see that about 80 to 90% of them are their supply chains, which are strewn across the world. And it's really difficult to measure things. So can you use AI to fill in data gaps? Can you use AI to make prediction so that you can see where you think there's going to be problems on the supply chain? So one company, Mir AI, is doing that. Another challenge is biodiversity risk. This is just getting on the docket of corporations, which is not just carbon emissions, but how are you impacting species? How are you impacting vegetation around the world with your activities? Where you're mining, where you're manufacturing, the gases that you're expelling and all of that. And so this other company was using AI to, again, analyze using sensors and then predict where you're going to be having the most impact by reducing your biodiversity and looking at different suppliers and grading them. And the key there is you can't rely on a lot of good data, so you have to do a lot of interpolation in doing it to move there. The final one, which Mike had talked about, is oceans. Oceans, soil, and forests are the biggest natural sinks of carbon, and they're so important to us. There's been a lot of work around forests. We've made some investments there. There's a lot of work around regenerative ag. It's very hard, but it's important. Oceans is kind of underinvested. And there's a company called OCN.ai who convinces really rich yacht owners to put sensors on their boats and is collecting about 20 million data points every day. And every 30 minutes, they're assessing the health of the oceans. That's interesting, but what's the painkiller? That's just like nice to know. The painkiller's coming out now. There's a person who's won awards from the UN, Ralph Chami. And if he's around here in Climate Week, I recommend listening to him. He's put a value on ecosystems and animals, an economic value, so that countries can start to actually monetize what they have. So the Bahamas has a huge amount of seaweed and kelp forests underwater, which are one of the best sinks of carbon. And so they can put a value, which is a couple $100 billion, on the waters that Bahama has jurisdiction for. And so now the question is, can they use that for bonds? Can they use that as collateral to help them as their islands are basically sinking?
Yeah, it's a fascinating opportunity. And we were talking, I can't wait until you can marry those two things. You've got the value of the oceans and the species and the wildlife that's in the ocean. All the fish, the overfishing problem happened, and there's no financial appreciation for the fact that you can no longer fish off the shores of Manhattan anymore. So it's a pretty fascinating segment. So then, now that you've given this award $100,000, how do you measure like the impact of that money and that investment?
So in general, the way you measure impact, it is a tricky thing right now. There's some really good frameworks out there. One I would suggest you look at is called the IMP framework, the Impact Management Project. And they're just asking very simple questions. What's the impact? How much? What are the risks involved? Who's being impacted? So answering those questions is really important. I think what's challenging is getting very quantitative about it. So there's two types of ways that we can invest in impact. One is direct and one is indirect. And I'll give an example. Direct is we've invested in a company, two amazing twin sisters. And this story is beautiful about, they were 15 years old. Their uncle started BB, which is a big fashion brand. And 70% of fast fashion ends up in landfill within 1 year. Huge, huge piles of trash in the developing world, unfortunately, is where it gets shipped to. And so they just felt really embarrassed. So on their side of their jobs and being in high school, they went to a lab and tried to develop ways to make sustainable fashion. And at 25, which is 10 years later, which is when I found them, they came up with a way to do it. They take CO2 emissions coming out of a textile plant and using multiple enzymes convert it into polyester. So no use of trees, minimal use of water and energy, and they make negative emission fabric. They have over 50 offtake agreements that are just waiting for it to scale up. There's obviously challenges, but that's just an example where I can look and say, okay, how much CO2 emissions are they avoiding? They're also sequestering, from that's coming from the plant. That's very quantifiable. There's another company we invested in, which is doing really well, and what their name is WeaveGrid. And what they do is they help utilities load balance EV charging. So EVs have taken off more than people expected. Let's take California, where I'm from. Next year, if everyone plugs in their EV at 9 p.m., the grid is dead. It cannot support the load that's there. So what this company does, and PG&E, which is the utility in the Bay Area, can't, even if they had money, they can't move fast enough on physical infrastructure. It's just impossible. And it's very expensive. So this company comes in what I would call a painkiller versus a vitamin because they have a real big problem. And they created software that they plug into, that they basically can control of the vehicles of the consumer and load balance in a neighborhood so that people aren't charging at the same time. And in return for that, give you a rebate on your utility bill. And so that program is really working as an example. So what is the impact? That company is critical, but how much do I attribute the emissions of an EV to that company versus to Tesla or to whoever the EV manufacturer? That gets a little bit more difficult. So I don't want the industry to shy away from those type of opportunities that you can qualify, but you may not be able to quantify.
You also focus on making change at enterprise scale and helping enterprises convert. Can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Yeah, so I think that there are two big ways that venture can make a difference. One is what I would call deep tech, where you're making big bets. And frankly, it's not even set up for venture capital the way it is, because you typically have like a 30-year life cycle, whereas we look at investments that can return to our investors in 10 years. And things like fusion fall into that category. Anything that requires a lot of R&D, that takes a lot of testing to do, and it's wonderful, and we should be working on it. And if we can solve fusion as an example, that is probably like the one biggest thing we can do. But then there's this other category, which is what can we do in the next 10 years? What can we make a difference? And you have all these enterprises that have said they want to go to net zero, but what they need to do is to measure, they need to analyze, they need to decide, they need to act, and they need to report. And in the US, we're hoping that there's going to be some regulation that will force it. SEC said yes, but we're still waiting. In the EU, it's happening, and it's happening fast. For example, if it is found that your supply chain is responsible for deforestation, they can dock up to 4% of your revenue as a fine. That's getting people to move. But they don't have the tools. And if you hire an expensive consulting firm, by the time they finish their analysis, everything has changed. So you need technology as an example.
Then you have to hire them again.
Yeah, and then to hire them again and again. And so we're investing in companies that can help all of those enterprises get there faster. WeaveGrid was one example.
That's fantastic. Raj, thanks so much for sharing with us. I hope you stick around for the rest of the day. I bet people have a ton of questions for you.
Thank you.
Thanks.